وآل محمد اللهم وفقنا لما تحب وترضى ولا تكلنا إلى أنفسنا طرفة عين أبدا. Once again, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another course with the Academy for Learning Islam. Our course for this evening is titled Islamic Perspective to the Theory of Evolution. And we've broken down the discussion into two parts. So we'll be having a part of the discussion this week. And I'll give you some things to think about, inshallah, and we'll continue with the discussion next week. I hope, inshallah, we'll be having a more academic discussion this evening. My goal this evening is not simply to present to you the Islamic perspective of the theory of evolution or to give you answers to the questions, but rather this evening I want to gift you with the questions that we need to ask if we want to truly develop an Islamic perspective of evolution. As the hadith says, asking the right question or asking a good question is half of the answer. So today we'll be exploring the questions more than we'll be exploring the answers. I also will ask you to pardon me if sometimes I do instigate a discussion or play devil's advocate. That is just my style, and the idea behind this course is not just to provide answers, but also to encourage some critical thinking and to also share with you some of the tools that we need in order to develop an understanding of contemporary issues. You will see that these tools that we'll develop, inshallah, will not only be important for us in this discussion, but also in many other discussions as well, and we'll kind of allude to some of that. I would ask you to ask questions wherever what I'm saying is not clear or there's something that I have not covered. That will be very important, and that when I do ask questions, I will humbly request you that you do respond and we can get a conversation going. Generally, this class works really well in a classroom setting. This is the first time I'm doing it online, but I hope we can make it just as engaging. And finally, I'd ask you to keep an open mind into the discussion that we're about to have. So let's get started with the session outline. What do we want to cover today? So firstly, I just want to go over the importance of discussing evolution. Why is this discussion even important, and can we see it in a bigger picture of what has happened in the last 2 to 3 centuries? Secondly, what is really important is an understanding of the subject and what is the theory of evolution. So by no means am a biologist or a scientist in that sense of the word, whereby I can give you the details of the theory of evolution, but we will go over some of the facts about evolution so that we understand what we're talking about before we give the Islamic perspective to it. Thirdly, we also need to develop an understanding of the alleged conflict between religion and evolution. A lot of Muslims are very uncomfortable with the theory of evolution itself, but when we ask them what makes you uncomfortable about it, there's the conflict in it. We find it very difficult to articulate the point of contention between religion and evolution, whereas we really can't develop a proper perspective if we understand what the conflict is. And then once we've outlined the conflict, then we will look at some of the relevant discussions in Islamic theology, and we'll be drawing from the works of the late Shaheed Murtaza al-Tahari, may Allah elevate his status. And then finally, I'll also give you an introduction to the discussion for next week, where we'll talk more about the conflict between evolution and the Quranic passages that we have, and see how we can resolve those, inshallah. So coming to the importance and relevance of the discussion, Sister Sarah, can you hear me clearly right now? Can everybody hear me clearly? Alhamdulillah. All right. Thank you. All right. So first, importance and relevance. Yeah, there seem to be at least two major views out there in terms of the, let's say, the origin of life. The first being evolution, and the other being creationism. And evolution, put very lightly for now, is the idea that, well, human beings and other species today evolved from simpler and less complex life forms, whereas creationism states that no, they were like that from the beginning of their, creation, from the beginning of life on Earth, and that's how they are. Now, although I'm using the word creationism, we'll see later that evolution actually contradicts with a theory called fixed form theory that was prevalent amongst the scientists 3-4 centuries ago. And that actually you'll see that there doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict between evolution and creationism, especially within the Christian context, is that creationism is associated with theism, therefore to be a believer, and this is something that Shahid Mutahari is going to, I'm going to quote him significantly on that. Shahid Mutahari says that there is a conception out there that to be a believer, you have to believe in the fixed form theory, whereas evolution has been more so associated with atheism. And whenever people talk about it, even like Charles Dawkins, when he talks about it, he says that theism was logically tenable before Darwin. Well, Darwin made it impossible to be an intellectually fulfilled theist, and therefore evolution is more so associated with atheism, and that's an assumption that we want to critically look at this evening, inshallah. But I also want to point out that this conflict that we're talking about is not just a conflict between religion and the theory of evolution. This conflict that we're talking about is actually a conflict between religion and science. And it's a conflict that started 3-4 centuries ago. It's a modern conflict. It wasn't there during the early days of Islam. It wasn't there during the golden years, 8 to 9 centuries of progress within Muslim countries and Muslim communities. But it's a more modern conflict between religion and science that started in the West. And it started around the 16th, 17th century with Copernicus, when he came out and proposed the heliocentric model of the universe versus the geocentric model for, not the universe, the solar system, sorry. And then after him, Galileo, and then after, this particular conflict between religion and science, the next most important conflict between religion and science came in terms of Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. And since then, there has been this perceived conflict between religion and science. In fact, there's a question out there whether this conflict between religion and science is simply inherent and unavoidable, or is this conflict between religion and science avoidable and not inherent to these two sciences. Now, this conflict by no means is limited to aqa'id, it's not limited to evolution, for example. This conflict also, spans out to other areas of concern as well. Can somebody share with me some other areas of conflict between religion and science? When I talk about science, not just the natural science, but the social sciences as well. Okay. Yes. Right. So, I think you're picking up some very important areas, one of them being same-gendered relationships, which we have mentioned on the slide over there. Bioethical ethics is another area of perceived conflict between religion and science. So what's important to realize over here is that some of those principles that we're going to develop in today's discussion will also be applicable in those areas as well. Political science and religion in politics as well. All right. Okay. Now, what is the theory of evolution? I've always emphasized to my students that a part of critical thinking is to actually understand the subject that you are talking about. It's very unfortunate that today in the Muslim community, though we have very strong perspectives and opinions about the theory of evolution, you can try out this experiment. You can speak to people within your community who have strong opinions about evolution and just ask them a very, very simple question. Ask them, what is the theory of evolution? And sometimes you get very superficial and very simple answers. You get an answer that states, well, evolution is the theory that human beings came from apes and monkeys. Well, I don't think exactly that is the theory of evolution. That might be one of the implications of it, but that's not really the theory of evolution. Whenever we ask about the Islamic perspective of something, the first step to developing an Islamic perspective of that subject is to understand what is that subject. So a view or a perspective, if you just follow me on the slides now, is predicated of a subject. Let me give you some example. For example, you say that eating pork is haram. Okay, so eating pork is a subject, is haram is the predicate. Now let's say if you wanted to say eating gelatin is haram, well obviously you first have to understand what is the subject, gelatin, and then you can predicate whether it is or it is not haram. I can give an example from akhlaq as well. In ethics, for example, you may want to say that humility and humbleness is a good character. Well, you first have to understand what humility is before you can predicate something of it. Now, here we're talking about the theory of evolution. Well, if we're talking about the theory of evolution, before we can predicate an Islamic perspective on it, it's very important for us to understand what exactly is this theory of evolution. So, the first important point that I want to make, and you will see why this is important later on, that the theory of evolution is a scientific theory, it's not a religious theory. That's very important. Now, given that it's a scientific theory, from a scientific perspective, I have a question for you. What question is the theory of evolution trying to answer? What issue had baffled scientists? What issue was of such great concern that they developed this theory called the theory of evolution to try and answer that question? Now, one of the common answers is, well, the theory of evolution is trying to answer, what is the source of life on Earth, or how did life come about to be on Earth? And that's not exactly correct. All right, Sister Sarah Zaidi says mechanism of change or adaptation. So those are some mechanisms within the theory of evolution. They use that to explain the theory of evolution, but that exactly is not evolution. How are all living things connected or linked to one another? We're getting close there. That's also important in evolution, but not exactly. Where did we come from, or how were we created? That's a very loaded question from Brother Ginan. I don't think evolution is trying to answer that. Transformation of lower levels to higher levels of life, how some of the things in the past looked alike to things today, and how did that happen? Gradual development of living things. So you're giving answers which are close, but I think Brother Shayan Durudi gave the right answer over there. What causes the diversity of life on Earth? What has caused the multiplicity of the species that we see on the Earth today? You see 1,000 different, or more than 1,000 different types of insects, hundreds of different types of animals, hundreds of different types of fish. You see hundreds of different types of birds. Amongst each species, you've got different types. How did all this diversity come about to be? I mean, that is the question that the theory of evolution is really trying to answer. So let's look a little more at this theory of evolution. So what is evolution? And right now we're beginning by defining for you microevolution. So just keep that term in mind. Evolution is defined as change over generations in one or more inherited traits found in interbreeding populations of organisms. To put it very simple, it's talking about heritable traits like, for example, a person's physique, a person's instinct, a person's the color of their body and the spots. For example, an animal has certain instincts that an animal has within a population through certain generations. So how are those heritable traits passed on from one generation to another generation, and how are they selected from one generation to another generation? So it's talking about, importantly, heritable traits that are not just passed from a part of the population to another part of the population, but more importantly, how they're passed from one generation into another generation. Now, some of the famous examples that if you read a textbook, you will come across these examples are first Darwin's finches from the Galapagos Islands. So back then when Darwin himself decided to travel to the Galapagos Islands, he finally reached those islands, and there were about 13 different islands, or more than 13 different islands of the western coast of South America, about 600 miles of the western coast of South America. And when he was in South America itself, on the mainland, he saw that there was only one species of finch. There weren't other species, or there weren't other types of finch. But when he went to the Galapagos Islands, which are small islands, but there are many of them, he found that there were many different types of finch, at least 13 different types of finch. Not only were they different types of finch, but he found that their traits were also different from each other. Some of them had big eyes, some of them had small eyes, some of them had rather big beaks, some of them had smaller beaks, some of them had bigger heads, some of them had smaller heads. And after a while, when he was able to identify them, he realized that they were best suited for the islands in which they lived. They were best suited to survive on those islands, and they were best suited to eat on those islands as well. And so he realized that they might have started off as one species that somehow got onto one of the islands, but later on they diversified and they adapted to their surroundings. Another example that's commonly mentioned in the textbooks is also the moth population in industrial Europe. So this is an example now of natural selection. In industrial Europe, before industrialization came about to Europe, they found that there were two types of peppered moths. They were light gray peppered moths and they were dark gray peppered moths. Most of the population were light gray, very few of them were dark gray. But then came industrialization. Part of industrialization was the use of coal. Coal created a lot of soot. That soot went into the air, and it made the forest just a little bit darker than it used to be. Well, because it became darker, they found that the dark peppered moths were able to camouflage themselves in the forest, and they were able to survive better than the light peppered moths. They were able to survive better than the light peppered moths, and therefore they realized that it's because the light peppered moths did not have the same security and the same camouflage that they used to have before industrialization. And this is an example of natural selection. Now, in order to understand evolution at a microevolution level, there are two things that you have to keep in mind. The first is the fact that there is diversity within one species. And then after the diversity comes the selection process. Now, one of the questions that you may have in mind is, well, a species, how does it develop diversity to begin with? How does it have different types within itself to begin with? And generally, evolutionists will suggest three mechanisms. The first mechanism is mutation. A person's DNA or genes, and animals or a species DNA or genes will randomly mutate and that's something that is inherent within nature. Secondly, through gene flow or migration, sometimes a group of finch, for example, will migrate to another area. A group of one species or a group of seeds will migrate from one area into another area, and they will bring about new, they'll bring about new traits into that area, and they'll bring about new DNA in that area. And third is through mating. So, when human beings come together or animals come together, they mate, and they create a unique combination of features from both parents. So this is how the variation comes about to be. Now, once the variation comes about to be, there has to be a process of selection as well. And selection is of two types. The first type of selection is human selection. So many of you might be wondering, for example, where did dogs come from? Well, dogs, according to some evolutionists, used to be wolves. This is before 12,000 years ago. As we'll see next week, 12,000 years ago is when human beings became stopped becoming hunters and gatherers, and they started to become farmers, and agriculture started at that time. They started to domesticate these wolves. They picked the wolves that they liked. They selected them from the diversity that was there, and they kept on selecting them based on the traits that they wanted to see. Now we have dogs that have evolved from those wolves because human beings selectively chose some of those wolves that best suited their needs. Now, one of the questions, of course, you will have is, evolution is very random. In the case of dogs and wolves, human beings selected certain types of wolves to have the dogs that we have today. But what about evolution when it happens in the world when there were no human beings? We're talking about time frames that go in the 100 million years, time frames that go into 1 billion years as well. What did the selection at that time? And this is where Charles Darwin comes in, and this is where his whole idea of natural selection comes in. Charles Darwin proposed the idea that nature has certain laws, and that there is a process of natural selection that allows for the survival of the fittest, and those diversities which are most adapted to their surroundings will survive, and the others will not survive. Now, this, very simply put, let me just quickly recap what we said. We said, one, it's important for us to understand what is evolution. Secondly, we said evolution tries to explain how the diversity of life came about to be on Earth. Thirdly, we say this diversity is created through mutation, random mutation, through gene flow, and through mating as well. And fourthly, we say that from this diversity that is created, human beings, or according to evolutionists, nature will select the one that is best suited for it. Okay, now this is the idea of microevolution. I don't think anybody really has a problem with microevolution. I don't think that creates any problem for religion or religious people. Of course, the main issue of discussion is macroevolution, and there's a difference between the two. Microevolution talks about how certain traits are passed on from one generation to another generation. So we're looking at a very small time frame and a very small span of time. But when we talk about macroevolution, we're talking about how very, very complex life forms actually originated from much simpler life forms over a very lengthy period of time. And the time frames that we're looking at sometimes are in the hundreds of thousands of years, or they're also in the millions of years as well. So to give you an idea of what macroevolution would look like, and why the theory of evolution, creates so much discussion and controversy, I've given you a suggested timeline, and just let's look at this timeline together. So evolutionists suggest that about 1 billion years ago, multicellular life started to exist on the Earth. So they say that around 4.6 billion years ago, is when the earth and the crust of the earth was formulated. About perhaps 2-3 billion years ago, we started to have water on the earth. Once we had water, about 2 billion years ago, you start to get single cells, and then about 1 billion years ago, you get multicellular life. About 500 million years ago, you get fish-like vertebrates. One of the most important changes that happens about 360 million years ago is you've got four-limbed vertebrates that move onto land, and it's a very interesting discussion as to what caused these fish to move out, because it wasn't just a question of moving out. The fins have to get converted into legs, and the gills that they have to be able to breathe air outside and not just be able to process air through the water. So they have to start developing the ability to breathe air from the atmosphere and survive with that. So what caused that sort of change is a very interesting discussion. About 255 million years ago, dinosaurs evolved, and they had a long period of time on Earth. They had periods of extinction as well. But 65 million years ago is when the dinosaurs really go extinct. None of these huge and large creatures are there. There are different theories for why they went extinct. The most popular theory was that a very large meteorite hit the Earth. But what survived at that time were birds and mammals. In particular, when we talk about mammals, are lemur-like mammals. Lemurs survived, and then they say these lemurs eventually turned into monkeys. Monkeys turned into apes. We'll look at that a little later today. And about 6 to 8 million years ago, the first human-like species, or more so about 3.6 million years ago, the first human-like species start to appear on the face of this Earth. This is where the theory gets quite interesting. And if you look at the image here on the right, this is what macro evolution looks like. And this is what we want to talk about today, inshallah. Any questions so far? Okay, if you don't have a question, then I'm going to have a question for you now. So, Ahsan, thank you very much. In the Quran, we're told man was created from dust. Are we to take this in the literal or metaphorical sense in relation to what was just said right now? Okay, so right now, firstly, I don't want to focus on the evolution of man. Let's just focus more so on the evolution of other species. Let's also clarify what are the questions at the heart of the discussion, and then inshallah we'll start to look at what the answers are. We sometimes do get ahead of ourselves and we do try to go for the answers directly. Let's first clarify the questions in our minds, and then inshallah we'll look at the answers. So this next slide is titled, "What is the problem?" And here I want you to tell me what is the problem. Because when we talk about critical thinking, the second step in critical thinking after understanding the issue is to identify and articulate the problems with that issue. In this case, the problem with evolution. Identifying the questions, though sometimes we don't like to do that, is actually the key to identifying the answers. We have that in hadith where one of the imams says, a good question is half of knowledge or half of the answer. And we can have no hope actually of providing an Islamic perspective of evolution until we understand what are the underlying questions over here. So here's my question. I believe the question is from the sixth Imam, Husn al-Mas'ala Nisful Ilm, if I'm not mistaken. A good question is half of knowledge. It should say half of knowledge to be exact over there. So here's a question for you then. Why is the theory of evolution a concern for religious people? Nobody comes and asks the Maulana, what's the Islamic perspective on Einstein's theories of general and special relativity? Nobody comes and asks about Newton's laws of motion. Yet, when it comes to the theory of evolution, which is a scientific theory, as I said earlier, there are so many questions about it. So what's the issue? Okay, so somebody said it negates religious beliefs. Um, I don't think it negates religious beliefs. What do you mean it negates religious beliefs? Like which beliefs? Okay, so Brother Ahmad Hamandi raises the first question. It contradicts the creation ability of God. All right, so the first question it raises is that it claims that there is no need for us to resort to God to explain how multiplicity of life came about to be. Good. Is the flood of Prophet Nuh. We're not going to go into that. Evolution goes against the idea of Adam and Hawa. All right, let's stop over here for now. You've identified one problem. You say that it alleges that God does not exist. That's one problem. Some of you have also alleged that it goes against the story of Adam and Hawa. What if somebody said it doesn't go against the story of Adam and Hawa? It actually goes well with the story of Adam and Hawa. Okay, it says that humans evolved from apes, while Islam says that Adam and Hawa started it. Okay, good question. What part of Islam says that? Where in Islam does it say that? Sayyid Akbari? It says that in the Quran. Excellent. All right. So, Shahid Mutahari articulates two distinct areas of conflict between the theory of evolution and religion. And it's important for us to realize these are two questions. They are distinct from each other, and they have to be treated distinctly as well. But unless and until these two questions are not clear for us, we will not be able to develop an Islamic perspective of it. The first question is, does the theory of evolution negate the existence of God? Because evolutionists, some of them claim that it does. Secondly, does the theory of evolution disprove the scriptural narration, so the Quranic narration, for Christians the biblical narration, for Jews the narration in Torah and the Torah, for the genesis or the beginning of man? Because it seems the Quran tells us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam and Hawa without a mother and father. They did not evolve. Islam doesn't talk about that. The Quran, doesn't talk about that. Yet it calls all of us the children of Adam. It calls all of us Bani Adam, right? So that is the second conflict. Now, here's an important point that I'd like to make. The issues will be treated separately from one another. So when I'm treating issue number one, when I'm dealing with the first question, let's not get into the second question. I may come and tell you that the theory of evolution does not negate the existence of God, and there's nothing wrong in that sense. You may have the urge to come back to me and say, well, but the Quran says that human beings came from Adam and Hawa. Well, I'm not dealing with the second question. I'm just first dealing with the first question. Let us deal with that first, and then inshallah we will come to the second question. Another important difference between these two questions is that the first question is a more philosophical question, and we have to deal with it in that sense. The second question is a more tafsir related question. We'll look at the second question next week, and inshallah before we look at the second question next week, we'll have to share some tools of tafsir before we can look at doing tafsir of these verses of the Quran. Is it fair to say that Nabi Adam and Lady Hawa were the first individuals with human intellect? So that question that you have asked actually falls into the second discussion, and we're going to take a very detailed look at that next week. But I don't want to mix it up with the first one. The distinction is a very important distinction for me. Okay, science and God. So when we claim that the theory of evolution negates the existence of God, this falls into a much broader discussion. It falls into the discussion of the interaction between science and religion. Often a young man will come up to me and say that, well, science has not proven the existence of God. Therefore, God does not exist. Or he will come and ask a question, can science demonstrate the existence of God? If science cannot demonstrate the existence of acceptance and understanding of reality, what that means is that if science can prove and demonstrate something, if science can explain something, that thing has reality. If science cannot explain that thing does not have a reality. So this doesn't just apply to the theory of evolution and the existence of God. This also applies to miracles, for example. Sometimes a person may say, well, miracles cannot occur because scientifically they are not possible. And therefore, unfortunately, our criteria for understanding reality has become science. However, there's a fallacy in this statement. There's a fallacy in this preposition. Where do you think is the fallacy in this argument? What is wrong in trying to prove the existence of God through science? This science relies on measurement, analysis. All right. In the past, science couldn't explain gravity, but it still existed. Okay. Science is limited. So if science became your criteria, then you would have to become an agnostic person. The most you could say is that the existence of God is possible, but the existence of God is not certain. Science deals with tangible, and we can understand that some things are not tangible. Only physical is limited and cannot prove the unlimited. Science is limited, our knowledge is limited. Not knowing does not mean knowing it is not. Yes, Brother Ahmad, you're correct. Does not mean that knowing it is not. So yes, science cannot disprove the existence of God, but at the same time, if your criteria is science and science has not proven the existence of God, then you yourself as well would not be able to believe in the existence of God. But many of you are putting your finger on a very important point, and that's the point that I'd like to come to. And I think it's important, if we are going to resolve this conflict or this perceived conflict between religion and science, we have to demarcate the scope of science from the scope of religion. A lot of problems have occurred in the history of the Western world because the scope of science was not demarcated from the scope of religion. Scientists sometimes try to say things that fall into the scope of religion, and sometimes people who follow a religion or religious scholars try to say things which fall in the scope of science. That's where the problem occurs. It's important for us to separate these two knowledges or these two sciences. I'm going to suggest right now, and I need you to focus on this suggestion, and then we'll look at the implications of it. So the natural sciences explain the natural and observable world, right? The scientific method. Science is actually about the scientific method, a systematic methodology whereby you observe the world and you make hypotheses about the natural or the social world, and then you test your hypothesis. But it's all about, empirical data, observing or being able to observe things. And therefore, the natural sciences, to say the least, work with, the natural and observable world. So, for example, when you place fire next to a piece of metal and it expands, well, science says that when metals are heated, they will expand. If you look at the cause, it was a physical cause. Heat is physical, and the expansion also is an observable result, that is physical as well. Therefore, science, you can say, explains to us the relationship between physical causes and physical effects. Religion explores, and I've put a very important condition there, amongst other realities. So religion not only talks about the metaphysical world. If you all would remember, religion talks about three things. It talks about aqa'id, beliefs of faith. It talks about akhlaq, ethics and morality. It talks about ahkam, laws as well. But one of the things that religion does talk about is the metaphysical world. And what is the relationship between the physical world and the metaphysical world? Now, if that is clear for us, it gets us into some very tricky territory. There are two questions with regards to evolution and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one thing I'd like to point out for some of our brothers and sisters is that sometimes a question is a very loaded question. Sometimes a person is asking one question and in there are loaded 2 to 3 questions. The art of critical thinking is to be able to, separate these questions from each other. When you talk about Islamic perspective, Islamic theological and philosophical perspective of the theory of evolution, you have to be able to make distinction between these two questions. The first one, what process facilitated or caused the multiplicity of species? How did the multiplicity of species naturally come about to be? The second question, given the assumption that it was evolution and natural selection, and does it negate the existence of God or not? These are two separate questions. Given they are two separate questions, now here's my question to you. The first question, is that within the jurisdiction of science or religion? It's very easy to answer, but you also have to be able to stand by your answer. So if you say that's within the jurisdiction of science, let's consider the implications of it. Whenever you answer a question, consider its implications as well. You say that it is a question that should be answered by science. What that means is that, therefore, religion should not at all come and say how natural processes come about to be. Just as religion does not offer a view on, let's say, the special theory of relativity or the general theory of relativity, religion should not also try to offer a view. Religious scholars should also not to dabble in, for example, how different species came about to be. So now I'm seeing more answers saying that they are both religion and science. So the second part of critical thinking is also to realize the fact that your answers should not be swayed by somebody badgering you or somebody nagging you or somebody exposing flaws in your argument. Actually, the first question is a question that falls under the jurisdiction and scope of science. And it is science that should answer that question. What process facilitated the multiplicity of species? Multiple species that we have today, that's a physical phenomenon. We're looking for the natural cause behind it. That falls under the jurisdiction of science. I understand it has implications. Its implications are that science should answer that question. Religion should not directly get involved in that question. As Allama Tabatabai says in some of his other discussions, if science comes and proves it, we'll come to it just a moment. If science comes and demonstrates that, look, multiplicity of species came about to be because of, natural selection and evolution, a philosopher, let's not use the word religion for now. I know when we talk about religion, you start thinking of the Quran as well. Let's use the word philosopher. A philosopher or a theologian, all he can do is accept this assumption and work based on this assumption. Okay? Now, coming to the second question, given that it was evolution, does it negate the existence of God? So where is that question supposed to be answered? Within science or within theology and philosophy? Sister Nagma says both for the second question. Um, well, science does not actually deal with issues which are beyond the physical. It doesn't deal with metaphysical issues. When we talk about God, that's a very metaphysical issue. How could science answer that question? So I think most of you are saying, yes, that's within the jurisdiction of theology, and that's very important as well. What that means is that a scientist should not, as a scientist, as a person who is in science, should not come and claim that, well, the theory of evolution negates the existence of God. Or as Stephen Hawking once wrote in one of his books, as a scientist, and it was a book of science, that, well, I studied, the Big Bang Theory, I studied the beginning of the universe, and I don't think there is a need for God. Well, we would say that that question just doesn't fall within the scope and jurisdiction of science. When a scientist comes out and says that, well, there is no need for God to explain the world that I see around me, he is speaking beyond his jurisdiction, and he's speaking beyond his scope as well. I think if we make the distinction between these two sciences, between religion and science, and what is within the scope of religion and science, then we should not get into this conflict. Another area of debate and discussion is about same-gendered relationships. And psychologists will sometimes say that some people have such an orientation, and because they have such an orientation, therefore same-gendered relationships are moral and they are not immoral. Using the same line of argument that I have used over here, can you use the same line of argument and demonstrate that there's a fallacy in this argument? Sister Sarah Hasni asks, what process facilitated or caused the multiplicity of species? So Sister Sarah, there's no doubt in my mind that causality is given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that at the end of it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is caused everything that happened on the face of this earth. Maybe I should have reworded that question. Scientists may want to ask, what is the natural process? What is the process in nature, if there is a process in nature, but what is the process in nature that caused the multiplicity of species? And because this is a discussion about nature itself and natural laws, therefore it clearly falls within the natural sciences and not within theology or philosophy. Morality is not subject to science. Okay, Said Hussein Askari from Texas says morality is not subject to science. When somebody comes and claims that same-gendered relationships are moral because some people have that orientation, what are the two questions that should come to your mind right away? But let's not get into the answers. As I said, we have the tendency of jumping into the answers. Let's not jump into the answers. What are the questions that you have to ask first? Okay, is it not natural? Okay. Okay. So I just want to answer a couple of questions raised over here. The first one by Brother Shayan Durudi. I think the point is religion can provide us with the answer to the first question. For example, through scripture. Remember, we're not dealing with scripture right now. We're just dealing with it from a very philosophical and from a theological aspect. We'll deal with scripture in the second question. We'll deal with scripture in the second question. But coming back to my original question, whether the orientation actually exists or not. Question number one, do some people have such an orientation or do they not have such an orientation? Secondly, okay. I have actually turned off my speakers because I was getting an echo as well. Okay, we're good. Alhamdulillah. All right. First question, do some people have such an orientation? Do they not have such an orientation? Second question, given that they have this orientation, is it moral or immoral for them to engage in such behavior? The first question, who's supposed to answer that? First question. Yeah, so, psychologists will answer it. The second question, who's supposed to answer that? Uh, Ethicists, to be more exact. Ethicists, and akhlaq is part of religion, is supposed to answer that. I think if we demarcate those lines, it becomes very clear. It becomes problematic when an ethicist comes and tells a psychologist that people don't have such orientations. That is problematic because the psychologist will say, but all my evidence shows that they do have such an orientation. But on the other hand, it also becomes problematic when a psychologist comes and says that, this is moral or immoral, where it does not fall within his jurisdiction. Okay, good. We're understanding the thought process, which is very important. We're running out of time, but inshallah we'll try to finish the last 3 slides. So, coming to the question then, does the theory of evolution negate the existence of God or not? That's the question that we want to answer today. One of the arguments for the existence of God is the argument of by design, also known as the teleological argument, Burhan-e-Nazm. It's one of the oldest arguments out there. And it argues that every design structure needs a... So this is how the argument goes. The argument goes, one, the universe has design structures. Secondly, every design structure needs a sentient designer. And it's very important for us to point out sentient designer, because otherwise even a person who doesn't believe in God believes that there is a designer to this universe, except it's not a sentient designer. So that's very important. And then the conclusion follows, therefore the universe has a sentient designer. Now the most apparent example of design is the complexity of life. I don't think you will find a better example than that. And I think we've relied upon that quite a bit in this argument for the existence of God. However, a scientist today, or Dawkins for example, will come and say to you that, well, we used to believe in God because we could not explain the multiplicity of life. Sentient means one who is conscious, has his own will, has his own, his murid, one who understands what he's doing and chooses, has the free will to make a selection. Human beings, for example, are sentient. A rock, on the other hand, is not sentient. I hope that's clear, inshallah. All right. Now, in the past, people, for example, believed in God because they could not explain how complexity in this world came about to be. It was unknown to them, and therefore they said, well, there is this creature called God that made it happen. How else could it have happened? But someone like Dawkins would come and say, well, today we know how it happens. We know how the complexity of life and diversity of life came about to be. It actually came about to be because of something called natural selection. And actually, to explain it, you don't need God. Hence, evolution negates the existence of God. And this is where I think the critical thinking comes in. And Shaykh Mutahari asks some very important questions over here. One of the questions that Shaykh Mutahari asks is, is there any correlation between microevolution and in our belief in God? If I were to believe in microevolution, the fact that certain traits are passed on from one generation to another generation, does it negate my ability to believe in God? I think we'd all agree that no, it doesn't. If that is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created things, then that is how Allah has created things. The more important question, though, is there any correlation between macroevolution and theism? Does it mean that you have to believe that everything was created in a fixed form and every species was created instantaneously by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Otherwise, you cannot be a believer. Shaykh Mutahari asks, isn't it possible for us to think and say that it's possible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the diversity of species through the process of evolution itself and did not create them instantaneously? Isn't that more closer to the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Isn't that how Allah usually does things? Doesn't He use means? Doesn't He use asbab to create things? Even when He, for example, creates the human being doesn't come into existence immediately. He comes into existence very gradually. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even mentions this in the Quran. When we look at this surah and this verse of the Quran that you see on the slide below, Allah says that indeed we have created you min turabin, thumma min alaqatin, then we have created you from a drop of fluid, and then from a clinging mass, and then from a fleshy tissue, partly formed and partly unformed, and we create in the womb that what we will, and finally you come out as a child, and that child grows as well. Just because this happened in a gradual method, does it mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not make it happen? Does it mean that it doesn't need God for its creation and for its evolution, so to say, for its growth, for its progress, so to say? Not at all. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put that causality into this particular creation. If we can see that, if we can accept that God can create things gradually, what is wrong with accepting that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created all the species that we see, with all their diversity that we see, not instantaneously, didn't make them like that from day one. He created them slowly through a process of evolution that went through maybe a billion years or 500 million years. What is wrong with that idea? Does it have to make a person an atheist if he were to believe in that? Nothing is wrong with that idea. Are we trying to explain evolution through religion? I think the point I was trying to make is that religion doesn't have to try and explain evolution. It's not within the scope of religion to explain evolution. Science must explain evolution. Religion then will have to look at it and say whether that is compatible with our belief in God or not. But wouldn't it suggest that the argument of design is not valid? Okay, there are two questions over here. I'd like you, if we can just stop asking more questions, I want to deal with them. All right, three questions that we have to answer. All right, that we have to deal with over here. Okay, firstly, wouldn't it suggest that the argument of design is not valid? So one of the premises in the argument for design, and that's why we need to have very systematic understanding of the argument. One of the premises in the argument by design is that every design structure needs a sentient designer. Now, it doesn't say that the sentient designer has to be the direct cause of that structure. For example, one of the examples that they give is that of a clock and a clockmaker. When you look at a watch, for example, you know that there is a watchmaker who made that watch. I think that's something we all agree. Question, what if somebody told you it wasn't a watchmaker that made the watch, rather it is a factory that made the watch? The obvious question that you're going to ask is, who made that factory? I will say to you that there is a mega factory that actually produces factories, and it made a factory that makes watches. The next question you're going to ask is, who made the mega factory, right? because you understand fitratan, in your innate disposition, that every design structure at some point needs a sentient designer. Similarly, if we were to argue that the multiplicity of species came about through a process called evolution, the next question that comes to mind is, who created and who put into place this process called evolution? And here we would say it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So no, it does not negate the need for the existence of God. The second question is, does it mean that the world evolved many years before Adam and Eve? Yeah, it could mean that. But the Talib is asking, does it contradict the creation of Adam being the first human? What mistake is Brother Talib making over here? Not to call it a mistake, but what's the issue that you would raise with this question? Does it contradict the creation of Adam being the first human? Remember, we're not trying to... Oh, sorry. Sorry, I couldn't see the answers. We wanted to separate the two. Exactly, he is conflicting the two questions. Thank you so much for following that distinction that we made. Yes, that's a question that we're going to answer in the second part of our discussion. Whilst I'm having the first part of the discussion, we said that we're not going to deal with that question. That simply helps us to develop a clear understanding of it. And lastly, I just want to answer a question of the brothers asked, doesn't Islam have an answer for everything? Islam teaches us three things. Islam gives us the answer to what we need to acquire our perfection in life, what we need to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The teachings of Islam fall into three categories. They're either aqa'id, or they're akhlaq, or they're ahkam, doctrines of faith, ethics of faith, or the laws of faith. Even what the Quran teaches us falls into one of these three categories. What this means is that the Quran is not a book of science. The Quran may have scientific facts in it, but the Quran is not a book of science. Even when the Quran does mention science, it is for the sake of teaching us our beliefs, aqa'id, or teaching us our ethics, akhlaq, or for teaching us our laws, ahkam, okay? And not for the sake of science itself. Okay, good. Doctrines, ethics, and laws. Alright, moving on, human evolution. I just want to introduce the next part of our discussion for next week, and next week's discussion will be quite interesting. So, evolution also suggests that humans evolved from simpler animals, and that's the question that you're grappling with right now. And they suggest the following timeline. 65 million years ago, dinosaurs go extinct, but lemurs survive. Around 35 million years ago, the first monkeys appear on the earth, according to evolutionists. Now, if you have a problem with this timeline, you cannot argue it from a religious perspective or from, a theological perspective. Let me make it clear. You have to argue as a scientist and prove it or disprove it within the field of science. 22.5 million years ago, the first ape appears on the face of the earth. And then up to 5 to 6 million years ago, the first human-like species appear in Africa. To be more exact, around 3.6 million years ago is when you have the fully bipedal ape, according to the scientists. And they're still in Africa. Around 2 million years ago, you've got the first human-looking like species from the Homo category, the Homo erectus, who had the longest lifespan of all other human-like species, about 1.8 million years. So they, lived up to until 200,000 years ago. And then finally, around 200,000 years ago is when human beings, or Homo sapiens, appear onto the face of this earth. At that time, or at some point in our history, there were 4 different types of human-like creatures. Homo sapiens, which is us. Homo neanderthals, who were in Europe, they were bigger than us. Homo heidelbergensis, who were more so in Africa and Western Africa. And Homo Florenses, who are mostly in Indonesia and Malaysia, also known as hobbits. Now, they say this is how human beings evolved. Before we tell you what the Quranic perspective is, and I know that we're itching to jump into that discussion, we followed a particular methodology, and I want us to follow the same methodology. We followed the methodology by saying that, look, one, you have to understand the issue. Two, after understanding the issue, you have to understand what are the relevant and important questions. And then three, we're going to tackle those questions. So, in my next slide, what other information do you need to formulate the Quranic perspective of human evolution? The second question, what are the critical questions that need to be answered to formulate a complete perspective? The session has come to an end right now. It's 7:06. Those who have to leave right now, that is okay. But if you'd like to stay behind and discuss these questions right now, we can do that. And inshallah, then next week, we'll look at it in a more detailed manner. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. That's a very interesting question. Where does Prophet Adam fit into this timeline? And I'm going to ask you that question next week. And again, it may be a simple question, but depending upon how you answer it, it is going to have consequences. When we talk about the evolution of man, one mistake that we make is sometimes we talk about it from a very biological perspective, the biological evolution. In fact, that is important, but not as important. There's another aspect of evolution that's even more important. Thank you for those who joined us. Jazakumullah khairah. Which aspect is more important? So I don't want to feed you with the answers right now. That's what I'm asking in the first question. What other information do you need to formulate the Quranic perspective? So that's the question I'm asking. You'll have to ask the coordinator if the recording will be available. Jazakumullah khairah. Well, I think we're generally called Homo sapiens. In terms of our intellectual growth, it might be different from the Homo sapiens who lived 200,000 years ago in Africa. We definitely have had an intellectual growth. But generally, looking at our features, we are known as Homo sapiens. Jazakumullah khairan misbah. Now, you asked about how Homo sapiens are different from us. Let me ask you a question. Why is that question critical to our understanding of the Quranic perspective? Somebody asked, what's the difference between Homo sapiens and us humans? My question was, how is that question relevant to our Quranic understanding? Ahsan, jazakumullah. So you've made that distinction. The Quran says He made Adam different from other creations. لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. We created men in the best form. So He is better. So maybe these creations did not have the aql. So Sister Fatima, are you saying that Prophet Adam may not necessarily be the biological father for all human beings? He may only be the intellectual father of all human beings. Well, you know, um, so Sister Fatima, you're also raising a second question, and the second question there is, when the Quran talks about Prophet Adam and God creating Prophet Adam, is it talking about it in a literal sense or a metaphorical sense, subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is it just saying that they were that they also had evolved, the only difference being that Prophet Adam and Lady Hawa had aql, whereas the life forms from which they evolved did not have aql. Ahsan, Sister Shamama, why would the Quran refer to us as Bani Adam? The Quran constantly repeats to us, Ya Bani Adam, or children of Adam. Why does the Quran call us the children of Adam if all of us are not the children of Adam? When the Quran refers to humanity as the children of Adam, it's referring to all human beings as the children of Adam. Okay, Adam and Hawa were created in heaven, while evolution is a process on earth. When you say they were created in heaven, what do you mean? Do you mean they were created in a metaphysical plane? How can a physical being exist in a metaphysical plane? Even the scholars, when they do tafsir of those verses of the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to Prophet Adam and Lady Hawa, go and live, uskunul Jannah, live in the Jannah. A lot of the commentators today say that Jannah, because the word Jannah means garden in Arabic, that Jannah was not that Jannah that we're talking about in the hereafter. It wasn't that garden, that we're talking about in the hereafter. It was a garden on this earth that they lived in. God says He made Adam in a form, then blew His spirit into him. So yeah, the apparent meaning of that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created a form that was Prophet Adam, and then put His spirit into him. But why can't we read that? And I'm just asking the questions here. I'm not answering them. Why can't we read that figuratively speaking and say that look, when Allah says He created Adam, He means that He created Adam through a natural process. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says He created all other human beings, right? We created you from a drop of blood, for example, and then we changed it and we made it grow in the womb. Allah says we made that happen. So even if Allah created Prophet Adam from a mother and a father, I'm just asking the questions, I'm not answering them. Even if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Prophet Adam from a mother and a father, He would still say in the Quran He created Prophet Adam. So I think we're realizing that there are some important questions that really need to be asked about next week. If I can just ask you, inshallah, to look at these two questions over here. Right, Sister Fatima, we're getting into the answers. But if I can just ask you to look at these two questions, do a little bit of research about the evolution of man according to science. And don't just look at it from a biological perspective, but I also want you to look at it from a geographical perspective. Coming out of Africa, when did that happen? From a technological perspective as well, human beings had periods of technological growth, the Fire Age, the Stone Age, and then when did human beings become farmers instead of just being hunters and gatherers? That's also very important for us to develop a clear understanding of the evolution of man. And then what are the critical questions? In today's session, there were two critical questions. The first question was what were the natural process whereby multiplicity of species came about to be? And then the second question was, does it negate the existence of God? And does it negate the existence of God was the more critical question over there. What are some of the critical questions that we need to ask before we approach the Quran? Yeah, so as far as I understand, Adam was an adult at the moment that he was created. And that's what critical thinking is about. That. How do you understand that? Where in the Quran does it actually say that Adam was an adult at the moment that he was created? That God created him as an adult. Okay? So it is assumed. Alright. Alright. So does the evolution of Adam through evolution go against the narration of his creation in the Quran? So that's the question that we want to ask next week. But that's a loaded question, Sister Fatima. You're going to have to break it down into more basic questions to really develop a fulfilling answer. Allah created man, and man is referred to usually as an adult. Okay, these are some important questions. Inshallah, we'll take a look at it next week. It'd be nice if you can come up with 2 to 3 questions that you think are critical in developing the Quranic perspective. Write them down. I'll just put down my email address over here in case you want to get those questions checked, or you want me to comment on those questions that you have developed. The goal of this is not to give you answers, as I say. The goal of this is to develop our thinking, to develop our thought process, and to provide you with the tools. So if you want to send those answers to me or your questions to me, feel free to do that during the week. And inshallah, then next week we will outline it before we look at the verses of the Quran. Ahsantum. Jazakumullah to all of you for joining us this evening.